Okay. Hello, hello. Testing one, two, three. It sounds like we're on. Testing again. Is that better? Okay. Thank you, Eric.
We can start. Pat's here. So we're very pleased to have Professor Cherny back for the second go round. He talked about the Coit Murals book a couple weeks ago, and eventually we'll get him back here to reach further back for the Harry Bridges bio.
Sure.
But meanwhile, this is the main event in a sense because this is the big book that came out in I think May, and yeah, we're very pleased to be able to have you all here to listen to what he's got to do in way of introducing it. So I will get out of the way and let you proceed, but don't really start till I get to that end, just in case there's some little detail I
Okay.
didn't notice, like
All right.
unmuting my broadcast or something.
Okay. Okay.
You know, these things happen.
Right.
Beckett. It's almost a habit. So let's see. We are indeed streaming,
Okay.
and we are indeed recording.
Good.
So yeah, you can go ahead. Thanks.
Oh, okay. Thanks, Eric. Thanks for inviting me, and thanks for the introduction. This is the book I'm going to be talking about. San Francisco Reds, Communists in the Bay Area, 1919 to 1958. It came out very early this year. Actually, I think I got my copies in late last year, but the copyright is this year. And I thought I'd talk to you a little bit about how I came to write this book, and then I'll read a few things here and there in the book, and then I'm happy to take your questions about it. And this book came about as a kind of a spin-off from the research I was doing for my biography of Harry Bridges. I started researching that biography in 1985, and I spent about the next 15 or 20 years doing research of various sorts, including interviewing a lot of people. And some of the people I interviewed for that book, perhaps not surprisingly to some of you, talked to me about their life as a Communist Party member. And so I had a number of interviews along those lines. And then I went to Moscow in 1996 to do research in the Russian State Archive for Social and Political History, because I'd been told that there was information there about Harry Bridges. He was mentioned a couple of times, but nothing really all that interesting. But I was there as a Fulbright teacher at Moscow State University teaching American history. And so I had a whole semester to spend at that archive. And I found not very much information about Harry Bridges, but a lot of information about the Communist Party in California. So much that I thought that there were some journal articles to be written about what I had found there. And eventually I did do two journal articles, one about the early 1930s and one about the later 1930s. And after I finished the Bridges book, I knew I wanted to do an actual book about the Communist Party. At first I thought I'd do one on California, but then I decided that was just too big. I couldn't possibly do Los Angeles, that the party's activities in Los Angeles were so complicated, and I had so little research past about 1940 on Los Angeles that I decided to just focus on the Bay Area. And I think it's a good thing I did, because this is still a pretty hefty book just on the Bay Area. And if I'd tried to do Los Angeles, it would have taken me years longer, and it would have been even a little big for a doorstop. So I went, because I did find so much interesting material in that archive on the 1930s for the Communist Party in the Bay Area. I went back again in 2003 to look at their material on the 1920s, again with the idea that I would be doing a book about the Communist Party. And it was that research in part that led me to the career of Victor Arnautoff, who was, some of you know, an artist here in San Francisco, who was a party member, and who eventually, he was born in what is now Ukraine, and he taught at Stanford, and then when he retired from Stanford, he went back to where he had lived in Ukraine, to the town of Mariupol, and did some really spectacular murals there. I'm sure they're all destroyed. That whole town is pretty much leveled now. And then he moved to what was then Leningrad, and that's where he died. And my interest in the Communist Party and my interest in Russia sort of led me to a biography of Viktor Arnatov, which I found faster to finish than my biography of Harry Bridges. So I finished the biography of Arnatov, then I finished the biography of Harry Bridges, and then I took up this book on the Communist Party in San Francisco. The Bridges book was really long. It's almost 500 pages, so it's truly doorstop size. But this book came together very quickly, both because I'd written those two articles already about the 1930s, and because I had all of the research done. I had all of the interviews, and I found a lot more interviews. I did spend some time at the Labor Archives at San Francisco State because they had some material there that they'd recently received that proved to be just really interesting, and I'll give you a quote from some of it a bit later. So let's see. Yeah, as I began organizing my thinking about this book, one of the things that became clear to me was that I had about 50 people for whom I had a lot of first-person source material. Some of them I had interviewed. Some of them I'd known and hadn't known that they'd ever been party members until it just sort of came out at some point in conversation. My wife's friend Judy Nitzberg, at some point when we were walking to the memorial service for Elaine Black, said yes, she had been a party member along with Leo, and there were other people like that who I'd just known through the course of things that I ended up talking to about what life had been like for them as a party member. I dedicated the book to Don Watson, who was another person, a longtime friend of mine, who had been a party member, and to Judy and Leo Nitzberg. But there are a lot of people who did either interviews with me or with other people that were available to me as a researcher. People who did oral histories for the Oral History Project at Bancroft Library in Berkeley. People who wrote their memoirs. And so I had a lot of first-person accounts of what life was like as a party member in this area. And that's the way I began to really think about organizing the book, organizing it around about 50 individuals for whom I had a lot of first-person accounts of what it was like for them to be in the party, what they did, what they feel their accomplishments were, what their frustrations were, and for more than half of them, why they chose to leave, because many of them in my group did leave, especially in the 1950s. A couple of them were thrown out and left in that way. Let's see if there's anything else I want to say about this. So it's really a kind of a running biography of these 5 people and the way in which they interacted with the Communist Party, beginning for some of them in the 1920s, most of them beginning in the 1930s, a few beginning in World War II and the early 1940s. But why they became involved, what they did, why it was important to them, why they left, if they left, and how it was important to them in their lives after they left. The book is really in 4 parts. There are 9 chapters, but there's the first couple of chapters deal with the 1920s, and that's based almost entirely on archival research. There's a couple of memoirs that were helpful there, but it's mostly archival research, including research in the archives in Moscow. Then there are 3 chapters in the 1930s. That's really the heart of the book. Not surprisingly, that's when the party was probably most active and most involved, especially in union matters. And then then there's a chapter on World War II. So there are a total of 4 chapters, the 1930s and World War II, that deal with Popular Front period. And then the final chapters deal with what happened after World War II and the decline that the party entered into at that point, and finally the events of 1956, 57, 58, when so many people left. So let me give you just a few samples here, and I'll kind of fill in a little bit. Chapter 2 is about the late 1920s, and I gave it the title Unceasing Factional Struggle, because that's a direct quote, unceasing fractional struggle, from one of the participants who just bemoaned the fact that in California, the party was just eaten up by this kind of fractional struggle. And what I tried to do is to figure out, as best I could, why they were spending so much time that way. And a lot of it was reflections of what were going on at a national level and even at an international level, because that was a time period when there was a struggle for power in Russia as well, in the Soviet Union, from which Stalin eventually emerged victorious. But leaders of the U.S. party were aligning themselves with different factions in Moscow, and when the Moscow faction would rise, so would the faction in the U.S. that was following them, and vice versa. But I think one of the other reasons was because they were so fixated on the fact, they believed, that there was an imminent revolution in the U.S. This was a part of what they were learning from the Comintern in Moscow. It's part of what party leaders here were arguing, that everything pointed to the imminent uprising of the American working class to overthrow capitalism, just in the same way it had happened in Russia. And that this was going to happen almost any time, and that party members had to be prepared to take the leadership when the working class would rise up in that way. And so they seemed to be spending their time in this kind of a millenarial belief that this was imminent, and that the way they could take leadership was to show that they were able to stand up to the police. So they would have big demonstrations and fight with the police, constantly fighting with the police, to demonstrate that they were willing to destroy bourgeois law and order in their terms. A lot of them ended up in jail as a result, not surprisingly. But let me read you a little section here about this. There's a big book that came out half dozen years or so ago by Yuri Slizkin, who is a faculty member at Berkeley. It's called The House of Government, and it's about the party leadership in Moscow in the 1920s and early 1930s. And it's a really important book for the thinking of Russian communists at that time period. So I start out by referring to it here. In The House of Government, Yuri Slizkin describes Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels as millenarian prophets and points to a millenarian aspect in the thinking of the Bolsheviks. One sees a similar pattern among many Californians who embraced Bolshevism in the 1920s. They read the same millenarian prophets, or they listened to party leaders who had done so, and who preached the inevitable and imminent collapse of capitalism and the party's rise to power. In 1925, Mother Bloor, who was one of the party organizers in California, preached that nothing on earth can stop the fall of this system of government. And while the communists do not advocate a bloody revolution, they know it is inevitable and want to be ready for it when it comes. That's close quote. Central to their thinking was the expectation of a spontaneous uprising of the working class, as had occurred in Petrograd in November 1917, and the belief that party members needed to take leadership, just as Lenin had done. As Reggie Karasek said, some of you might know Reggie Karasek better as Peggy Dennis, she said, "We were confident that we alone were tapped by history to fulfill its mission for humanity's liberation from exploitation and oppression. We alone had the answer as to how this could be done." And so they were so fixated on this that it really sort of consumed all of their activities. And then in 1930, there were some important changes that redirected those energies to other areas. Now, one of those obviously was the stock market crash in October of 1929, bringing about the Great Depression and massive unemployment in the early 1930s. And in 1930, California and the entire district got a new organizer, Sam Darcy. Sam Darcy was a very young guy, but he had had a lot of experience up to that point. And he and Earl Browder were sort of at loggerheads in New York. Browder apparently arranged for Darcy to be sent to California as district organizer so that Darcy could fail, because every district organizer in California had absolutely failed and had to be, as they said, assigned to other work. Being assigned to other work usually meant being sent someplace else, sometimes even sent to Russia to do things there, but getting them out of a particular situation. But Darcy was different in important ways from his predecessors, and he faced a different situation with the collapse of the economy and the massive unemployment. Darcy had come from a working class family in New York. His father had been a union member, and Darcy wanted to organize unions. Instead of just sort of hoping that the revolution would come, Darcy wanted to really do something concrete. And he set about doing that. The party, before he had arrived, had organized what were called unemployed councils, which were sort of organizations of the unemployed. And what Darcy did in 1933 was to take some of the really good people from the unemployed councils and send them out to do agricultural work up and down the Central Valley. He had a plan starting with the harvests from the north and moving south, organizing at each harvest until they got to the southern part of San Joaquin Valley in October with the cotton harvest, when he was able to pull 12,000 agricultural workers out on strike, the biggest agricultural strike up to that time ever in American history. They weren't entirely successful, but they got a significant wage increase. And so this is really the way Darcy was reorienting the party. Instead of spending their time in fractional struggles, fighting with each other over the correct interpretation of Marx and Lenin, and the different party leaders who they were aligned with, he focused them on doing organizing the unemployed, organizing workers. And he did much more than that. Here I'll summarize. That's not what I wanted to do. Let me get the right page. Yeah. So by 1935, the Communist Party had become much more visible in the Bay Area and in California more generally. Under Darcy's leadership, the CP issued its own newspaper. He was responsible for creating a newspaper. Supported strikes by farm workers and maritime workers, the great 1934 longshore and maritime strikes. Gained a place on the state ballot. For the first time, they were able to get their candidates on the statewide ballot, and made a respectable showing in the 1934 elections. Darcy was able to accomplish all of that between his arrival late in 1930 and early 1935. In doing so, Darcy and some party members had moved away from the strident rhetoric of the late 1920s and toward the political mainstream, running for candidates for office and organizing unions. Those patterns reached a high point in the next 4 years. So I look at what happened in California in the late 1930s. And by 1938, I argue that the party had really moved very close to the mainstream. They were very involved in the 1938 state election in supporting the Democratic Party's candidate for governor, and in opposing an initiative vote. The business leaders had organized an initiative to ban all picketing because, there was all this union organizing going on in the 1930s. So there was an anti-picketing initiative in California that brought together the CIO and the AFL, which had been at loggerheads from the time the CIO emerged, and brought even other groups, other civic groups into this initiative to oppose the anti-picketing initiative. And it carried over into the election for governor. So that California in that election elected the first Democrat as governor since sometime in the 19th century. It had been a third of a century since there had been, or more, since there had been a Democrat elected governor in California. Culbert Olson was the governor who was elected in 1938. And the party had been very involved in those efforts to organize union members to oppose that anti-picketing initiative and to organize them to support Olson and other New Deal Democrats in the state and local elections. So here's how I summarize all this. The California Communist Party in late 1937, 38, and early 1939 moved very close to the political mainstream. During the existence of the Popular Front, party members worked closely with non-communist progressives and embraced Roosevelt and the New Deal. By doing so, they gained some influence in state and local politics. They were able to have discussions with legislators about what would be introduced in the legislature in 1939. They were able to have discussions with candidates for state offices about policy issues. They had really moved that close to the mainstream. And then, unfortunately, in 1939, the German foreign minister went to Russia and negotiated a non-aggression pact with the Soviet Union, which the U.S. party interpreted as a de facto alliance between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union. There were many Communist Party members who were horrified by that, by the way, and some of them, it was the beginning. For some of them, it was really the beginning of their disillusionment with the party. But nonetheless, the party saw this as a signal that they had to cut some of their ties to the New Deal Democrats, because the New Deal Democrats began immediately wanting to give support to England and France when Hitler invaded, all of which began in 1939. And between 1939 and 1941, the Communist Party was very much on the outside looking in because of the way in which they were reacting to this non-aggression pact. And because they were condemning Roosevelt as being a warmonger because he was giving support to England when England was standing alone against the Nazis in 1940. And then in 1941, Germany invaded the Soviet Union, and at that point the Communist Party was back to the Popular Front and aiming to rejoin the mainstream. Let me see if I want to. And I want to give you, go back to the 1930s a bit. During the 1934 strike, some of you know this history, I know. 2 men were killed on July 5th of 1934, and there were 100 people who were injured by the police as they were protecting strikebreakers. And the governor then sent in the National Guard to protect the strikebreakers. The Communist Party helped to organize a massive funeral demonstration for the 2 men who were killed. They had a funeral procession that started at the Union headquarters at Stewart and Mission Street, went up to Market, went all the way out Market to Valencia, and then down Valencia. And they filled Market Street with the mourners, following the caskets of the 2 men who had been killed. It was an incredibly powerful demonstration of union solidarity because all the city's unions took part, and of just popular support for the strikers as well. So here's what Edith Arnstein later wrote. She and her cousin were watching this from the sidewalk on Market Street. She says, "I am going to march." I join her. I hope our fathers are not watching. We pledge our lives that Sperry and Burdois have not laid down their lives in vain. And Edith later joined the Communist Party. Angela Gysi was also there watching. She was a daughter of Italian immigrants. She'd recently graduated from Berkeley. She was working as a translator for the Bank of America, but she left work to go watch the funeral procession. She called it the most spectacular thing I've ever seen, and then she said it made her a radical. So, that's the kind of information you can find from the people, from the interviews, from the memoirs, and so forth. Let's see, what did I, oh no. Now I'm jumping into the post-1945 period, when the party had really been in high popular front mode all through World War II. And then at the end of that war, Earl Browder had converted the party from a party to a political association, and said that, our future lies in continuing to work with New Deal Democrats as a separate organization, but one that would be allied with New Deal Democrats. And then came a message from Moscow. No, you got it wrong. This was called the Duclos article. A French Communist Party leader, Jacques Duclos, published an article in their journal that had been sent to him from Moscow. I mean, we know it was written in Moscow. It was sent to him to put in the French Party's journal for American communists to read and to get the message that they'd taken a wrong turn and that they should not be aligned with the New Deal Democrats, that they needed to be a separate and Marxist organization. And what that meant was that a lot of people who had really gotten involved in union organizing and working with New Deal Democrats to win elections began to get a bit alienated and began really questioning this turn, the Duclos turn in the party's position. Now, I just want to give you a little section here about ordinary life in the party in the late 1940s and up to about 1950. Because party at that point was organized in clubs. There would be neighborhood clubs, or there'd be clubs for particular occupational groups. And the clubs would meet regularly, and I'm going to tell you a bit about this. This is Robert Truhaft. Some of you know him. He was a lawyer. He was the husband of Jessica Mitford. And here's what he said about a typical party meeting in the late 1940s. It would usually start off with an educational, where somebody had been assigned to report on either a theoretical work or on a practical matter of interest to communists. And you'd have to be well prepared for that. Those who weren't giving the educational were expected to have done the reading. Now, I found an account by another woman about her reaction to this. She said, "It was like a book club where nobody really understood the books." And I think it was some of those meetings that Dorothy Ray Healy was talking about in her memoir. Dorothy Healy, you know, she started in Oakland, and then she was a party leader in Los Angeles for a long time. And she said, most of the meetings I sat in on were very boring. So let's see what else. Oh, in the 1940s, there were also a whole series of expulsions from the party. The party was, at this time, the party was under a lot of outside pressure. The House Un-American Activities Committee, the FBI, they were all investigating the Communist Party. It became a little bit dangerous for people to be an open party member sometimes. There was a lot of this kind of outside pressure, but at the very time this was going on, the party also kind of fell to consuming itself through expulsions. And the records that I found at the Labor Archive that had recently been brought there include some internal party records from that time period about the expulsions. And so I thought I'd give you a little sample of that. Left sectarianism was not the only basis for expulsions. In 1948, the party's state review commissions drafted a report on its work over the 3 years since the reorganization that came with the Duclos article, noting that its most important work had been smashing the left sectarian faction. The committee's draft also reported on other investigations or expulsions, and now I'm quoting. In the course of the past 3 years, we conducted 300 hearings, expelling 70 members for left sectarianism and 10 right opportunists, 2 stool pigeons, 5 homosexuals crossed out and written in morally corrupt. And the draft also noted that the California Party had expelled some 400 individuals over the previous 15 years, the largest numbers of whom they described as, quote, swindlers, thieves, and financially irresponsible people, Trotskyites, and other political revisers of Marxism, paid reformers, and stool pigeons, and then went on to say that in every one of the groupings we find that the majority were guilty of white chauvinism or anti-Semitism, or rotten liberalism. That's the quote. Rotten liberalism meant tolerance inside the party for those who disagreed with the official party line. So that they really fell to essentially to consuming themselves with all of these expulsions. 2 of the people who are in here are people that I talked to about being expelled. Keith Eichmann, did any of you know Keith Eichmann? He was an officer in Local 6 for a long time. And Keith told me that he had been expelled because in a union stewards meeting, he had had a disagreement with a close friend of his who was black. But he had disagreed, and they disagreed quite a bit in the stewards meeting, and he was therefore expelled for white chauvinism. And he continued to be that man's friend, and he continued to be active in the union, but he was out of the party. Dorothy Ray Healy said that in Los Angeles, the white chauvinism campaign became a way for people to get rid of people they didn't like by coming up with some kind of a charge and then getting them expelled. Let's see, what did I want to give you here? Oh, yeah. In 1948, the party supported Henry Wallace as a progressive candidate for president. That was a party decision, and it meant that they were really breaking all their ties with New Deal Democrats who stayed with Harry Truman in that election. And here's what some people have said about that. This is Robert Kenney. Robert Kenney, some of you may remember, he had been state attorney general. He'd been a candidate for governor at one point. He was a really prominent, very New Deal oriented, very left leader in the Democratic Party in California. And in 1953, here's what he wrote. From a purely California standpoint, the third party movement was just part of the misplaced militancy that developed in the left after the Duclos letter, and he called it utter folly. Sam Darcy, who had been thrown out of the party because he wouldn't go along with some of the Duclos letter, he remained very much on the left, and he's looked back on this years later and said that that the Wallace campaign destroyed some leaders and candidates of real progressive character who held great promise. And he may have been talking specifically about Robert Kenney, because Robert Kenney never recovered the position he'd had within the Democratic Party in California afterwards. And Eugene Dennis in 1956 said that the Wallace campaign had been erroneous and harmful, even though he had led it. I mean, he's now reflecting on his own role. Erroneous and harmful, that it widened the cleavage in the CIO and weakened the ties between the left and the mainstream of the labor movement. So this is, there's the Duclos letter, then there's the Wallace campaign, and things just continue to kind of move the party further into the fringes than it had been since the 1920s.
The letter was in response. You said they were going out of being
allied with the Democrats, yeah.
Allied with the Democrats.
Yes.
And the letter was telling them to break that alliance, or
The letter was saying that it was a mistake to convert to a political association instead of a party, that they should be a party, they should be a Marxist party, they should be a party of the working class. And they interpreted this as, in 1948, as meaning we should support Henry Wallace. Now, some really interesting popular front things did survive in San Francisco, and perhaps the most prominent one was the California Labor School. I don't know, some of you may have memories of the California Labor School or know something about it, but it was, as the name suggests, it was a school sponsored by the party that taught all kinds of things. They taught Marxist theory, they taught a Marxist version of history, but they also had art classes that had virtually no theoretical or political content. They were straightforward art classes. Victor Arnautoff was teaching his California Labor School art classes the same way he was teaching his art classes at Stanford. And there were language classes and literature classes. Every year they had a big artist ball where all of their art students would have fanciful costumes but this also fell out of favor with the party leadership. And here I'm quoting again from one of the drafts. In the school itself, promotion of unreliable and anti-party elements into various positions of responsibility and leadership, including bohemian elements, drunkards, homos, lesbians, chauvinists, and possible agents operating within this grouping. These elements are in some cases non-party. In many cases, they carry party books. And then they went on to a much longer quote here. Among these elements, a large circle including volunteer workers in various capacities and students who are found in various groupings carrying on life of a bohemian, including heavy drinking, loose moral conduct, smoking of M in some cases. This carried on in private homes and in bars, with participation of various of the individuals, listed, and in some cases others in full-time leadership. This sort of extracurricular activity after affairs. However, sharply exemplified each year in the annual artist ball at which numbers of lesbians and homos gather. The party was very, very opposed to anyone who they thought set themselves up to be approached by the FBI and become an informant. And if you were gay or lesbian or smoked marijuana, you could be set up that way, because those were all crimes with heavy penalties in California. And so there's a kind of a moralistic tone here, but there's also a tone of, the party has to do this to protect itself. And some of the people they expelled because they were gay or lesbian, the party was rather apologetic about doing it. In other cases, as you can tell from the language, they didn't seem to be all that apologetic about what they were doing. So the party shrunk. And then came the events in 1956. In early 1956, Nikita Khrushchev, the premier of the Soviet Union, had a secret speech in which he laid out all of Stalin's crimes, murders and imprisonments, and sending people to getting rid of any kind of political opponents to his own rule. And Khrushchev laid this out in just excruciating detail. His speech went on for hours, and it was supposedly a secret speech, but the copies soon began to circulate. And on June 4th of 1956, the U.S. State Department released a 58-page translation of Khrushchev's speech. The guess is that they might have gotten it from a U.S. Communist Party official who had gotten a copy of it, because it was read to party leaders before it was made public. The next day, the New York Times printed it all. So it was there for everyone to read, all party members. So Edith Arnstein Jenkins later wrote about her reaction. We who had linked years of humanist struggle to our belief in the USSR were shocked past understanding. We swung between anger at those who had deceived us and at ourselves for our own part in our deception. Dave Jenkins, her husband, many of you probably can remember Dave, it was like a rape, a mental and emotional rape, because we were involved with hundreds of non-party people to whom we had denied the possibility of these slave labor camps, the murder of honorable and fine people. And I want to give you Bill Bailey's reaction. Let's see if I can find it here. Yes. Then later in 1956, that's early 56, later in 1956 came the Soviet invasion of Hungary and overthrowing the government in Hungary and installing a new government in Hungary. And so here's Bill Bailey's reaction to that. He said it was the straw that broke the camel's back for him. He'd earlier been told that he should go underground in the late 40s, early 50s. And he just told them, go to hell. Any of you know Bill Bailey, that's him. He was a Marine fireman, and he took no gruff off anyone. He said, I remember thinking, you stupid bastards, is this socialism at work? He informed Walter Stack later that day, I've had enough of the party's stupidity and bungling. Stack was very upset by this. He and Bailey had been in the same union. Did any of you know Walter Stack? Walter stayed in the party to the very end. He was, but Bill Bailey was very forthright in his reactions. Then, after these events in 1956, there were a lot of people who left, and there was a major national convention to try to figure out where do we go from here. And the California party leaders who were at that convention were a significant force. And I'm trying to find, they had argued that we needed to have a significant change of direction if the party was to survive. And it didn't happen. And so in March of 1958, I'm not finding what I'm looking for here. 26 local and state party leaders resigned at once with a formal statement that they sent to party headquarters. It was never published, but there's a copy of it in one of their oral histories. And here's what they had to say about it, that they were resigning because of the party's deeply rooted dogmatism and total isolation from emerging social movements. And they said, had we to choose again, we would identify ourselves with it for the same reasons it caused us to do so then. These include the party's important role in the unemployed movement, its contributions to organizing workers in basic industry, its effective participation in the fights for Negro rights, its pioneering efforts in the struggle against war and fascism, its solidarity with the socialist sector of the world, its aspirations for a socialist America, and its studies of scientific socialism. And that resignation included some of the most prominent leaders in San Francisco. It included Oleta O'Connor Yates, who had been the longtime head of the party in San Francisco. And her husband, Alan Yates, just shortly afterwards said that they had resigned because of the Khrushchev revelations, which he said caused us and other hardcore communists to reevaluate our positions. We came to reject the absolutism of communism, its pat answers for everything, party line answers. And I think that kind of reflects many of those who left. Dave Jenkins thought that 80% of the membership in San Francisco resigned in those few years in the late 1950s. I think he got it a little bit high, but 80% may have reflected the people that he most often interacted with in the party. This is another quote from a woman, Carol Queno, who I knew over a number of years. She had been the archivist at the ILWU. Later, she was an archivist at San Francisco State. She said, I was trying to find someone to talk to. I called Oleta saying, Oleta, I have to talk to someone. My recollection is that we set up a time and place, and before that meeting took place, Oleta left the party. I remember doing the same thing with Loretta Stack, and the same thing happened. It became almost a comedy. I didn't know who else to turn to. She was trying to talk to someone to find out whether she should resign or how to resign. And she said, so by default, I left the party. All of the party's leaders had already gone, and she didn't have anyone to consult with. So how did this affect their lives? And I'm going to give you just a couple of examples here. Here's one. My life was enriched by having been a communist. And another one said, the party had shaped our lives, given us a way of viewing the world, framed our family life, and influenced our selection of friends, books, movies, and activities. Bill Bailey concluded his memoir by saying what had guided his life, both in the party and out. To witness an injustice and do nothing, that is the biggest crime. And for Bailey, he first followed that rule in the party, and then he followed it outside. Keith Eichmann, who was actually expelled and was quite critical of the party, said this, the party gave me an understanding of the class relationship of society. It gave me a political attitude that made me different from any of the others in the Union who didn't have that background. I don't think they understood politics to the same degree. So, that's just a few examples of how people thought about how important the party had been in their lives and how it continued to be important, because of those who left the party, they all became liberal Democrats. They continued to support the same things they had worked for in the Popular Front. They supported unions. They supported an end to racial discrimination. They opposed war. They marched in anti-war marches. Some of them counseled draft evaders. They continued to do the same kinds of things, but as liberal Democrats rather than as party members. And one of the conclusions, I don't quite say it explicitly, but I think that you would draw the conclusion, is that for those people, the Popular Front was a fundamentally important part of their lives. And they continued those commitments once the party moved away from the Popular Front, and once the party moved out of the political mainstream in that way. But these people still wanted to do all of those same things and to continue to work with liberal Democrats to accomplish those goals. And they did. So I'm happy to take any of your questions or your comments. Oh, sure. Yeah. Just speak up.
Could you tell the story of how Judy Nitzberg left the party?
The question is, could I tell the story of how Judy Nitzberg left the party? This is a story that Judy had told us, and it's in the book. She said that one day she and Leo went down to Los Angeles. They were going to see some friends, and they had flown down, apparently. I think that's what I'm remembering. At any rate, she was wearing slacks. This was late 1940s, I think. And their friends met them and said, we have to go to a meeting. There's a meeting that we have to go to. And she said, but I'm wearing slacks. And it's in a black church. And she said, but I'm wearing slacks. I can't go into a black church wearing slacks. And, oh, yes, it'll be all right. It's an important political meeting. So she went. And then she and Leo were expelled for not showing proper respect in a black church by wearing slacks. It's a story that Judy told us a couple of times. It's kind of like Leo Eichmann's story about his expulsion, and it really does, for me, reinforce what Dorothy Ray Healy had to say about how the white chauvinism campaign probably targeted some people appropriately, but it was just also a way for people to get rid of people they didn't like. And Keith Eichmann said pretty much the same thing, that in his case, it was someone in that union who didn't like him and was trying to undercut him as a union officer who led that charge. I think I know who it was too, but he didn't name names, and I would be only guessing. And yeah, there was a question back here.
It's sort of apart from what you said, or it's in your preliminary things to what you said. Could you talk a little bit about, I don't know, what your experience was of being in the archives of the Soviet Union, how they handled the materials, how they treated you,
Yeah.
whether they were even surprised to see you, things like that.
Yeah, sure. I'm happy to do that. When the Soviet Union collapsed, there were a lot of big changes. And one of them was that the central archives of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union became the property of the Russian government, the new Russian government. And they began to open it to researchers in a way that had never been opened before. And one of the first people to go there was John Haynes from the Library of Congress. And he told me, he was there, I don't know, 1992 or 93, thereabouts. And he said it's just, an incredible collection of material, because what had happened beginning in the 1920s and all the way through the late 30s was that the U.S. Party sent files to Moscow for safekeeping. They sent them to the Comintern. The Comintern is this international organization of the communist parties in all countries. That's the Communist International. And it was an organization where Americans took part in Comintern leadership as well. And so they sent things there for safekeeping, but they also sent them because of the way in which the Comintern related to the American Party. The American Party really thought of itself as part of an international organization. That's the way they thought of what it meant to be a communist. And there was an Anglo-American secretariat within the Comintern that consisted of representatives from the English-speaking parties, especially the U.S. and Britain. And the Anglo-American Secretariat would periodically meet with American Party leaders who had come to Moscow to discuss what's going on in the U.S. and what they proposed to do about it. And the Secretariat would discuss this with them. Sometimes the leaders of the Secretariat would then discuss this with higher levels of the Comintern, and they'd come back with a recommendation to the U.S. party leaders about what they should do. Sometimes they came back with a directive to U.S. party leaders about what they should do. Other times it was more of a recommendation. But it's an iterative process that was going on. And all of this involved sending lots of documents there about everything that's going on in the U.S. So there are copies of the internal correspondence between Sam Darcy and the New York office there in that archive. After I was there, I went to see Sam Darcy. He was still alive. He was living in Florida. And I took copies of some of these things and showed them to him. And he said, "Where did you get this? How did you ever get this?" He had no idea that these things were being sent from New York to Moscow to be put in the Comintern archives. So between about 1925 and about 1938, it's a very, very rich collection of material. It's a rich collection of material for almost anyone doing American history in that time period. And it was very easy for me to use it. There were no barriers to an American coming to do research there. There were language barriers, but because I was teaching at Moscow State University, I could have a student assigned to me as a translator anytime that I needed a translator. Because, the finding aid was in Russian, obviously, so I needed someone to help me. But once I sort of got the hang of it, I could handle it pretty well myself. One day when I went in, there was a guard that I had to check in with every day coming into the building. And I'd been going there for a month or more at some point, and he pointed to my computer and he said, "Computer?" And I said, "Da, computer." "Niet, computer." "Da, computer." And then I walked on in with my computer and went on upstairs. And then when my translator came for that day, I told her about what had happened, and she said, "Yeah, well, you're supposed to have permission to have a computer. Let's go on downstairs and talk to the person that registered with you." And she explained all of this, and the person just took my registration card and wrote on the top, "Computer." And then that made it okay for me to bring in the computer from then on, but they told me a great story about this. The first American to go there was John Haynes. John Haynes told me this story. John Haynes said that he wanted to use his computer there, and they said, "No, you can't use your computer. You can't use your computer. I'm going to write out my notes, and then I'm going to go to my hotel room and enter them in my computer." They said, "Oh, well, you might as well bring your computer." I think that the leadership of this archive was suddenly having to deal with of the sort they'd never encountered before. And they were learning, just as we were learning how to interact with them. And I'll tell you one more story. I was a regular visitor there for 4 months. I probably went 2 to 4 days a week during the whole time I was there. I only had one class to teach. I had an afternoon lecture on Wednesdays and a tutorial on Friday mornings, and the rest of the time I was free. And so I did spend a lot of time at this archive. And I got very used to the woman that was in charge of the reading room where I worked. She couldn't speak English. I couldn't do anything more than say hello. But she got used to me. And she would set out my boxes of archival materials in the same place, knowing that I'd be there to do the work. And one day, and there was only one place to plug in my computer in this entire reading room. There was just one spot where I had to sit to use my computer. And one day when I showed up there, there was somebody there in that one spot. So I worked for a little while until my battery started running down, and then I left. And I don't know, I never said anything to this woman. I couldn't explain the problem to her. But the next day when I showed up, my boxes were right there next to the outlet, saving that spot for me. So on International Women's Day, I brought her a big box of American chocolates as a thank you for all the help that she'd given me. Other questions or comments? Oh, it's now very difficult to use at archives. Now it's changed significantly. I don't know that Americans are even able to do it, but they put up lots and lots of barriers to using it now. But it's all online now, so you don't have to go to Moscow. You just have to be able to figure out where to find things using the Russian finding aid. But if you can make your way through that part, you can find anything online. And that's really nice, because I was doing a little bit for this book. There were a few things that I needed to check. And it's a little difficult, but I knew an approximate date, and I was able to find what I wanted. And of course, the documents from the US are all in English, so there's no language problem at all. The documents, Comintern documents, would have been in Russian, English, German, and French. I think those were the 4 languages of the Comintern. And if I couldn't find the English version, I could at least make my way through the German version in some cases, because all the most important documents were in all 4 languages.
Excuse me, just without getting into the real details of it, is the Verona file these files, or is that...
No, it's a whole different thing. The Venona files are U.S. files that were collected by the predecessor of the NSA by picking up the radio communications between consulates and embassies here going to Moscow. And they were all coded, but they managed to decode a lot of them. So that's the Venona files. They're also easily available online now. And there are some notebooks, the Vasily notebooks. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, a former KGB officer was going to write a history of the KGB. I think I'm remembering all of this right. And he took a lot of notes on KGB files that he had access to. And then things changed, and the notebooks came here. And so we now have his notebooks, which help to identify some of the information that from the Venona files, for example, or from other files that are available. So I refer to all of those things in the book. Yeah, now you'd have your hand up for some time.
I'm kind of curious. Your very informative talk is, I don't know whether to laugh or cry. The tragedy of what happened to the left, and it seems to be in such a decline in this country, at least, perhaps even worldwide. Have you had any comments or thoughts about what this implies for present day organizing or activity?
The simple answer is no, because I'm a historian, and it's really, I write the history of things that are in the past. We can't project the future. Marx tried that, Marx.
But I thought history is supposed to inform us.
Yes, well, I think maybe if you want me to draw some lessons from this, is one of the lessons was what one of these, I think it was Olita O'Connor Yates said at some point. You have to think for yourself. Don't let somebody at some higher level tell you how to think. You have to think for yourself. But I don't think that our left has ever had that kind of, the recent left has not had that kind of a problem. But she was really talking about, don't accept blindly the dictation that comes from higher levels. I don't know. I feel very frustrated and anxious about what we're facing now because we have no clear left, no one to really push the Democrats in a way that the party did push the Democrats at times. I don't know. If there's a message at all, it's you need to organize. You need to develop a group of people who trust each other too. And you have to be willing, as many of these people did, you have to be willing to give it your whole life because a lot of these people really did give it their whole life. Yeah, sorry, I can't do any better than that, but yeah, go ahead.
What was this in the 20s? San Francisco and LA were about the same size. What was the Communist Party size at that time?
Well, there's not always reliable numbers, but it was pretty small. In both, but LA was more active than this area. In the early 20s, the party was organized by language units. And this was a carryover from the old Socialist Party. The Socialist Party had language federations, and many of those federations bolted from the Socialist Party to form the Communist Party. And LA had some really strong language federations, especially a Jewish federation that was, I think, very much at the center of what was going on in Los Angeles. And some very important leaders came out of Los Angeles in the 20s. Bill Schneiderman, who was the longtime California leader from 1935 until 1956 or 7, so more than 20 years. He had various titles in California. He was secretary, he was president, the titles chairman, the titles changed. But Schneiderman came out of Los Angeles initially. I mentioned Peggy Dennis. Peggy Dennis, who was married to Eugene Dennis. Eugene Dennis actually came from up in the Northwest somewhere, but when he met Peggy, he came to Los Angeles, and he became prominent in Los Angeles with different names. At one point, he was the American representative to the Comintern in Moscow, and Peggy Dennis, in her memoirs, has accounts of what life was like in Moscow in the late 1930s when all of Stalin's show trials were going on and people were disappearing, including some of their close friends. Sam Darcy was also the representative in Moscow for a few years, and so was Bill Schneiderman. So 3 Californians in a row represented the U.S. Party in Moscow. I'm losing track of your question. I'm sorry, I got sidetracked here.
Just around the size.
Oh, the size, numbers, yeah. Well, let's see, let's say in 1933, there were a bit over 2,000 members statewide, about half in Los Angeles, the rest in the rest of the state, maybe 1,000 or so in San Francisco. Now, but then it grew in significant ways. I've got all the numbers in the book, but I didn't keep them in my head. In the 1920s, just a few hundred here and there. But again, very much in terms organized by language. There was a very strong group way up the coast among Finnish immigrants. They were very left. And so up around Fort Bragg, and that area where there was a big Finnish community, there was a strong party unit there in the 20s. San Francisco, there were a lot of different language groups in the early 20s, and none of them quite as dominant as the Jewish group was in Los Angeles. But they organized that way and held socials. By all of these language groups would often have socials with music and dancing and so forth. So that given their common language, and this became a real social part of their lives, to attend party events that were then followed by singing and dancing. The language federations were dissolved in the mid-20s on orders of the Comintern. The Comintern was concerned about that this kept the party out of the political mainstream, and that the Comintern directed that the language federations had to be dissolved. People had to organize either neighborhood organizations or shop organizations, that this was a better form of organization, and that everybody had to become a citizen so you could vote. This is the way the Comintern would sometimes come in and tell the U.S. party what to do. And, in retrospect, that was pretty good advice, I think, if they wanted to be effective. But it was really disruptive in the short run because a lot of people didn't speak English. And so by being in these language federations, they were able to be more involved in the party than they were when they were thrown into some kind of a neighborhood group where they might be the only one who spoke their language. So it was very disruptive in the short run, and they lost a lot of members as a result. And it wasn't really until the Darcy's organizing in the early 30s and the effect of the Great Depression that the party began growing in a significant way. Let's see, I'll take a question over here.
Did Victor Arnolf ever have disillusionment with the Soviet Union? Do we know, or was he a true believer?
That was one of my questions. The question was, did Victor Arnolf ever get disillusioned when he went to the Soviet Union? And the answer is, I don't know. He didn't leave any records, that he didn't express any disillusionment to his children. I was able to interview his son. But I did find his second wife's son. So I don't know, a stepson, I guess, would be the relationship. And this man really disliked Victor. So it's a little hard to cut through his dislike for Victor to try to pull out. But that was one of my questions to him. And I think the answer is probably maybe. I do address this in the book, toward the end of the book. I try to pull out what I can in that regard. And I think that he maybe was a bit disillusioned.
It certainly would have been a hard place to express that disillusionment. So.
Exactly right. And at least in the short run, when he first got to there, he was treated really well, and I think he had a good time with that. He got some really big commissions to do huge murals of the type he hadn't been able to do since the 1930s. And I think he was really very happy in Mariupol. And then he remarried, they moved to Leningrad, and I think he became a very small fish in a big pond there in terms of the artistic community. And I think maybe that also contributed to a bit of disillusionment. Now, there was another question over here. Yeah, go ahead.
So I don't know the history of the left all that well, but I thought I was a little surprised that there would be a strong, I think you referred to as a millenarian sense about with the party leaders. Few as these people were, but in the 20s.
Yeah.
And was that out of the continued surge of the revolutionary fervor still running through the world, like 10 years after the Russian Revolution?
Mm-hmm.
Or is that something strange about
Well-
Or is it a Comintern line, or is it actually just a sentiment among those California communists?
Yeah, no.
That's something.
So the question is about the millenarian thinking in the 1920s.
And was it specific to California?
No, it was by no means specific to California. It came from the very top. It comes from Marx. It comes from Lenin. The argument that all history shows that history is a class struggle. The numbers of classes continue to get smaller. Eventually, it's a bourgeoisie versus the proletariat. And we know from study of history that the proletariat is going to win. That's a really gross simplification.
No, so in a
But
sense, it's an afterglow of 1848 or something. Or
well,
something
it's
or Marx.
yeah. For Marx, history was the science that helped you to predict the future. Historians today don't pretend to predict the future, but that's a simplified reading. Stalin, in the late 20s, issued what was called the third period analysis of the world affairs. Third period meaning the third period since the end of World War I. He saw specific time periods. And he said the third period is going to be the time when the proletariat is going to organize and overthrow capitalism, and we have to be prepared to take leadership. So, it's not just Marx that they're reading and not just Lenin that they're reading, but they're also getting this directly from Stalin, that the time is imminent. Be prepared. The millennium, meaning the victory of the proletariat, is at hand. And of course, Stalin turned out to be wrong about that, and then moved away from that third period analysis in a few years. Yeah.
Did he write that before he expelled Trotsky from the party? 'Cause that was Trotsky's line.
That came about 1928, 29. He'd already won at that point and expelled Trotsky. But he took, he was willing to take these ideas and use them for his own uses.
Yeah. Oh, a question regarding the people who were, as you described into what you were talking about, the people who had got out of the party in the late 50s and continued to be political activists, but within more or less what you described as liberal Democrat structures. Among the people who had actually been through the Popular Front period and operated within a real party structure and cooperation with the Popular Front and the New Deal and all that, and then stayed on till the late 50s, so they presumably had more or less positive about that period if they'd been through the Popular Front, and then but then they were out and were continuing then trying to be political activists without a party structure, a really left party structure to support them. And did anybody say things that would be about how that worked?
Well, what
kind of left without the
those who resigned en masse in 1958 said that we are looking forward to forming a new organization, but it didn't work out. And time and again, this would be what would happen. Leah Schneiderman was the wife of Bill Schneiderman. Bill Schneiderman, as I said, longtime head of the party in California. Leah joined the party in the 1920s. I interviewed her in the 1990s in a senior center in Oakland. And she said, "Bob, I've left the party. I've found a new organization that I think is the hope of the future, not the party." And a good friend of mine, Jack Kurzweil, who I knew through the faculty union at San Francisco State, when I was talking to him about this book, told me essentially the same thing, that in the 1990s, he left the party because he thought that the committees of correspondence was going to be the way in which the left would organize itself and would be able to. So, there's this hope of finding something, but none of them quite worked.
Well, I think a lot of them. I know my mother was a party member, and she was active in the civil rights movement and in the peace movement. So she was no longer a party member, but she was still felt like she was.
That there were other movements that they involved themselves in, but there was no umbrella group in the way that the party tried to do all of these things. And I think maybe that's the point here, is that there was nothing quite that emerged that allowed people to try to focus on all of it. And that the left has continued to be rather fragmented. We may focus on particular things at particular times. No more questions, comments? Well, thank you all for listening to me. Thank you, Eric, for giving me the opportunity to talk about my book.
Thank you all for coming out. The book is here, there's copies up there. So grab one if you're interested, and I hope some of you are interested. I did say if anybody wants to throw a little coffee money at Bob, there's a bucket up here at the front. Some people have already very nicely done that, feel free. And keep your ears tuned. We'll get another installment on the Harry Bridges book. If you don't mind.
That sounds fine. I'm happy to do that. That's a really big book, though. It'll take me longer to talk about all of it.
6 consecutive days. So it's a good excuse to get on our email list for the store.
Okay, that sounds fine.
Yeah.
And if any of you want, to buy a book, I'm happy to sign. I have my pen ready to go.
All right, thanks again. Thank you.
When my father first retired,